time. It is 7:05, so I might kick things off because I don't want to be here all night. So as I said, my name is Michelle Hanslow. I'm an Environment Project Officer at Nillumbik Shire Council, and I've been working with Council for 3 years. Started as the Biodiversity Officer, and the last couple of years I've been managing 3 different deer projects, a couple on deer control, and this one is our education and engagement project. Before we begin today, though, I would like to say that I'm presenting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may also be here today. So welcome everybody. Today's presentation is part of our collaborative community deer control project, which is funded by a Communities Environment Program grant from the federal government. Tonight's session is the second of at least 6 deer events for 2021, and today we'll be focusing on deer shooting in peri-urban areas. So it's designed to go into a little more depth on the deer control options in Nillumbik and focusing on shooting as the main methods. We are aware there are some other options. As I mentioned, it is technically an interactive session. You do have the ability to put on your camera and microphone if you would like to talk publicly, to ask a question, to share a story about your property. But it's probably easiest if you just write questions into the chat, and we can get to those throughout the session. Very basic housekeeping. As I've said, please keep your audio and video off if you're not presenting or asking a question. And I would like to ask also no promotion of your deer control business or volunteer services. That's not what tonight's about. It's just about information. We'll have other options for promotion of your services and how you might be able to help. So firstly, tonight I might ask people to turn their cameras on as I mention them. I'd like to introduce our special guests for tonight. We have a panel of people that can answer our questions or your questions. We've got Richard Francis from Abseco, who is an ecologist and also one of our deer controllers. We have Jake Haddad from Victorian Pest Animal Control, again one of our deer controllers. We have David Laird from the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, and I am pretty sure I saw Brett Conabare, who's from Wild Game Resources Australia, who are a group that harvests deer. So we've got pretty good representation across the board there. Fantastic. And Kirsten Reedy, who is the Environment Coordinator. She'll be helping out tonight with the questions and tech issues. So we can potentially answer some of the questions in the chat, but otherwise we will ask the questions through the session as we go. So thank you to all of you for helping me out tonight. I'd actually like to perhaps start by asking people if they could write in the chat what in particular you would like to gain from tonight. Like, what questions would you really like answered? And I suppose I'm trying to find out really whether I'm talking to a group of landholders who are concerned and unsure what to do, or a group of hunters that know all about shooting and just want to know how they can get involved in Nillumbik. So can I ask everyone just to pop some of those comments in the chat for me so I can find out what you're interested in. Just give you a couple of minutes for that. I am hoping that there will be some support for reducing the number of deer. So can I shoot deer on my own property? That's a very good question. Okay. Yep, clarification on where to shoot is fantastic. Okay, so it's pretty mixed and that's awesome. So I guess for some of you, the information that I present will be perhaps fairly obvious already, but we're going to have people at all levels of knowledge, so we have to cater for everybody. So hopefully we can keep you interested. All right, so let's see if my slide moves on here. Advance, okay. All right, so tonight we're going to cover where deer are found in Nillumbik and why that's actually important to know. Where and under what situations deer shooting is permitted in Nillumbik, so that should answer some of your questions. We'll look at the differences between professional and volunteer programs for harvesting, hunting and culling, and what the different hunting methods are that are used. I will go over my thoughts on how to decide when to use a professional or commercial deer contractor or a volunteer. I'll talk about carcass management options, that's always fun, and how council hopes to be able to help landholders in selecting deer controllers and prioritising areas for control, and look at a checklist that I'm putting together that should help with providing some best practice in peri-urban deer control. So it's all about safety, respect and productivity if we can. And if we get time with all the questions that I hope you will give me, I will update you from the learnings that we've had from our Sugarloaf Link project, which includes an element of deer control. That's still ongoing, so results aren't finalised yet. And hopefully we can also discuss a current case study that I'm looking at. And I'd really like to add too that all this information is based on what I've learned over the last 2 years from landholders, from contractors, from the government, from university researchers and hunting groups. DELP, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, state government, is in the process of developing a series of regional deer plans, which is an action from the Victorian Deer Control Strategy. And so the first one of those off the bat, thankfully, is a peri-urban deer action plan. And as part of that plan, we're hoping to see standard operating procedures or protocols around peri-urban deer control, as it is recognised as being different, excuse me, from other deer control in other areas. Okay, so let's get on with it. There we go. Firstly, where is your deer problem? Where you're seeing deer might hint at the species, because we know where they hang out. We've got the sandbar, red and fallow deer, but more importantly, the location that you're seeing the deer might influence the permits that you need, the techniques that are used and the type of controller that you might want to select. So I've shown this map probably a few times. It's some of the sightings and control sites and damage sites that have been recorded within Nillumbik. It is skewed towards peri-urban areas, and that might be because that's where the deer are, but I suspect it's more to do with the fact that they're a bit more visible in urban areas because you can see them in the backyard, whereas on larger rural properties, they might be down in the back paddock and you can't see them. And also peri-urban property owners are less likely to have much of a clue as to whether they can do any control. They probably don't own a firearm or know whether they're able to discharge it on their property, whereas rural landholders might just take the problem into their own hands, so it's not even seen as a problem and they don't need to feel the need to report it to council or anywhere else. And also just as a side note, because this question was asked at our last session about the use of deer scan and where we get our information from and how many users there were, we have 78 unique users reporting deer sightings across council, which is not very many. They've submitted 343 records, which included a total of 666 deer sightings across Nillumbik. But we've got some key people that do record those sightings, with the lovely Frank recording the most for us with 42 reports so far, and we really value that information, and we'd like more landholders to report deer sightings, calls, damage, signs that they've seen, because that gives us a much better picture of where they are and where we might need to focus some strategic control works and help out landholders. Okay, so shooting is allowed in some areas of Nillumbik, and that depends on the property size, the proximity to houses, the land tenure, and different permits and licences are required in each. So on private land, if deer are deemed to be a problem, then landholders or someone that they hire can control deer on their property under the GIC, that's Governor in Council, Unprotection Order. And so with a signed landholder permission form from that order and a valid firearms licence, you can control deer. If the property is deemed to be, we'll go over the Unprotection Order a little more. If the property is deemed to be in a populous or public place, then a public place permit is also required. And I suspect that's an area that any of the hunters here are probably a little grey on. So we'll go over that in some detail. The public place permits are generally only available to professionals, so vermin controllers or professional hunters, and those permits are from Victoria Police. If the property is large, and like in a rural area, it's likely that a public place permit is not required. And so daytime recreational hunting would be okay, as well as also control under that GIC Unprotection Order. Always check with the Divisional Firearms Officer, DFO, just to make sure that they're happy with you shooting there. And for the recreational hunting, you need a firearms licence, the landholder's permission and a game permit. So you don't need that game permit when hunting under the GIC Unprotection Order, even though they're still a game species. Okay, so unreserved Crown land. This is doesn't seem as relevant to me as we're talking about control on private land predominantly tonight, but the hunting that does occur in these unreserved Crown land parcels does contribute towards the management of deer populations, so we can't ignore it completely. The Game Management Authority has a hunting map which shows areas where you can hunt sambar and other deer species using different methods, and there are a couple of areas in Nillumbik, there's a few areas in Nillumbik which are mapped as hunting areas, but they're so small that they would be prohibited under the Firearms Act to actually discharge a firearm. So they're essentially a public place. So the community that have these hunting areas near their properties are probably rightly concerned, and some of these hunting areas have actually been removed from the map because of complaints being put through to the GMA. And other of these areas, although potentially large enough that you might say they're not public places, they still might have tracks through them or roads, or they require you to illegally trespass on private property to access them. So they're still not accessible for recreational hunting. Please contact Victoria Police if you are concerned about any potentially illegal shooting that you hear or see. Public land. So there is other Crown land within Nillumbik. We've got Kinglake National Park, the Warrandyte Kinglake Nature Conservation Reserve and Plenty Gorge as some examples. And control in these areas is generally coordinated by Parks Victoria, and they might use professional hunters or members of Sporting Shooters Association of Australia or the Australian Deer Association. But work within these parks requires this Section 37 permit. So that's an internal induction process permit. So it's not something that you can just request to get access to these parks. So essentially, there is no recreational hunting in the public land or in the parks within Nillumbik. So for all these situations, private land, unreserved and public land, they all require a firearms licence that is appropriate for the control of deer. And the recreational hunting, which is daytime, so dawn to dusk essentially, it requires a game hunting permit as well. So that control under the GIC order does not. So just a little more.
Excuse me, Michelle.
Yeah.
Kirsten here. When you're talking about this slide here, Andrew would like to know if a property has a trust for nature covenant on it, and the management plan calls for a reduction of deer, does that qualify for an unprotection order?
Yeah, that anything that's not Crown land as the underlying, so basically anything that it's got Crown land as the status of the land requires an authority to control wildlife currently. But if it is not Crown land, then it doesn't need the authority to control wildlife, and therefore, yes, it defaults back to that unprotection order. Yes, so even on some council properties, if that's not Crown land, the unprotection order is all we require as well. So the authority to control wildlife is just for that Crown land. Hopefully that answers that question. We can definitely chat about that property. I think I know the one we're talking about. Yeah, so this unprotection order, it's in place for 10 years. It covers all deer except for hog deer, and it allows deer to be controlled on private land where they're causing damage or injury to property and assets without that authority to control wildlife. So the game hunting principles do not apply. So that means that you can hunt at night and using spotlights, and you don't need that game hunting permit. So on that private land, you could use a professional, a volunteer or a recreational hunter, except in those areas that are regarded as public. So in fact, that trust for nature property, if it has public access and walking tracks through it, it might be regarded as a public place, in which case a permit will be required for that. The Unprotection Order also sets out the minimum requirements for the firearms, calibers and projectile weights. And unlike the minimum requirements that are listed on the GMA, Game Management Authority website for control of or hunting of deer, which includes firearms and crossbows, crossbows are not listed under this GIC order. So that means if you are wanting to use crossbows, and that's not what tonight is about, that would only be available as a recreational hunting option. Any deer that are taken from this order, by taken we mean shot and killed and then removed, need to be tagged with the property address, and anyone that is acting under this order must carry a signed copy of that permission form, which is this one here. So this section here lays out the, sets out the minimum requirements, and this is the permission form here. So that's valid for 12 months. When acting under this order, you still need to comply with wildlife game regulations if you are in recognised deer habitat. Now, Nillumbik doesn't happen to be recognised deer habitat, but surrounding areas like Cardinia, Mansfield, Mitchell, Murrindindi, Strathbogie, Whittlesea and Yarra Ranges Shire all have recognised deer habitat, so you need to act in accordance with those regulations and of course with the Firearms Act. Okay, are there any other questions at this point on shooting on different land tenures and the Unprotection Order?
There was one question which Jake has answered about the use of thermal cameras. And yes, you can use them on private land with a GIC order was the answer.
Yeah, that sounds right.
There's a question here about where do you find the forms?
Yes, I have put that on the council webpage under this project. Oh, I will double check that. If not, it is also on the Game Management Authority website, but I'll actually send a copy out to everyone with the link to the recording so that you've got that.
Fantastic. And there's some chat about noise. Will you be talking about that later in your presentation?
Yeah, to a little extent, yes, when we're talking about the actual control methods, yes.
Okay, we'll leave those for them. Yeah,
fantastic. Okay, so public places, these mysterious things that no one seems to know. I actually did have a meeting with Victoria Police yesterday to try and seek some further clarity on this because it's a grey area, and I think the conclusion that I came to was it's not up to me to decide. Always speak to the Divisional Firearms Officer for absolute guarantee of what Victoria Police's stance is on it. That's the best bet. So public places, the obvious ones are things like shops and schools and churches and sports fields, those places where the public gather. But what is probably unclear to most people is that private properties can also be deemed to be a public place and therefore require a public place permit. As I said, these are granted by Victoria Police and only to those with a business registered as a professional vermin controller or a professional hunter. These permits used to be property by property based, but now they are a rolling permit that covers all of Victoria for 12 months, which means that if there is an injured deer or other animal in a public place, a controller can go out and dispatch that animal if they need to, without needing to go through that process of applying for a permit. So you should check whether Victoria Police deems a property to be in a safe location for shooting as a recreational or volunteer shooter by contacting your local divisional firearms officer. Our local one, who covers quite a big area, is based in Diamond Creek. It's definitely better to check rather than assume that you know, because if you don't and somebody reports that you're shooting to Victoria Police and they investigate and they determine that the property you're hunting on is a public place and you don't have that public place permit, you do risk losing your firearms licence, probably amongst other things. So it's just not worth the risk. So how do they decide what a public place is? Well, it's not just the size. There are many factors to determine if a property requires that permit. Some of it is size, and if you look at this map, you can see that down around Eltham Research, we have some teeny tiny properties. They become a bit bigger moving into the centre, and up the north area towards King Lake, we have some larger properties. But even size alone is not a definitive answer as to whether hunting or control will require the permit. The DFO also considers proximity to houses, safe shoot zones, whether there's any walking tracks, the usage of the area by people, the topography, the vegetation, and the DFO's knowledge of the local community and how they might respond to shooting in the area. So the DFO will do a desktop assessment using mapping services to look at the terrain and vegetation cover and the houses nearby, but they often also come out to look at a property themselves if they're not familiar enough with it to make a determination on that basis alone. And just to let you know, the average property size in Nillumbik, I think I calculated this correctly, is 1.8 hectares. That is pretty tiny. So many are around 8 hectares. There's a couple that are 40 hectares and a very few that are 100. But in the scheme of things, that is really small. And it's just nothing like the normal hunting areas that you might get out in state forests. And I think everyone needs to be really mindful of that. Okay, so if a public place permit is required, the controller needs to present the DFO with a shoot plan. I hope everyone's okay with me saying DFO now, Divisional Firearms Officer. You need to provide a copy of a shoot plan as well as proof you've got all the licenses and permits. And you need to be able to demonstrate the site has been inspected and all the hazards noted. So a safety plan's also required, and this map, which needs to be provided to show where the shooting will be occurring. So this is an example from our control program that we're running. And so it shows the property boundaries, it shows shoot zones, in this case the yellow areas, zones that are excluded from shooting. So that's an entire property, but it might be just areas around houses. This plan's really great in that it shows, really clearly shows the location of all the houses, so you know that you can't shoot towards those houses. It's got contour lines, it's even got direction of potential deer travel, and it might also have tree stand locations and other information. As I said, you also need to provide the DFO with standing operating procedures, risk assessments, permits and licences, the landholder details, and also neighbour notifications. Now, notifications are extremely important to council, as it means that not only does Victoria Police know who is shooting where, but the neighbours know that they will be expecting to hear some shots fired. And I tell you what, knowing what's going to happen will make you feel a lot more comfortable than suddenly hearing a shot go off in the middle of the night. Okay, Kirsten, are there any questions about where people can shoot and the permits and licences required?
Not at the moment, Michelle.
Excellent. Cooking with gas. And if our panellists want to jump in and anything I've missed, that would be great too.
Yes, Jake here from Victorian Pest Animal Control. I'd just like to add, Michelle, I'm not sure if you mentioned that a public place permit is obtainable by a non-professional shooter, but it's on a case-by-case basis. So just wanted to make sure that the guys out there that aren't professional know that it is possible to get a public place permit. It might be a little bit more difficult, but it's a matter of speaking to the district's firearms officer in regards to the property, and they might say, yes, you're okay to shoot on there. Then, you know, if it's the next level up, they might say, well, you require a public place permit and let's assess it. And then, you know, they might turn around and say, no, it's not possible. So just thought I'd let you know.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We did ask the DFO to be here tonight so that he could clarify some of these questions. But yeah, I haven't needed to go through that process, so I don't know. But always worth asking the question, having that conversation. And
definitely. Yep.
Yeah, yep. And for the DFO to know you as a hunter, whether you're volunteer or recreational, however you want to, wherever you are in that hierarchy, so to speak, it's a really good thing to have a positive working relationship with the DFO.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Michelle, David Laird from SSAA. It's certainly a regular question that we get from hunters wanting to know where they can shoot and how they go about getting the popular place permits. As a recreational hunter, it is extremely difficult to get them. Basically, Licensing and Regulation Division have made it quite clear that it's going to be extremely difficult. So really, they're for professionals, and I would just urge anyone who's interested in sort of helping out and shooting in those areas, they need to be very, very conservative and reinforce what you said. Contact the DFO and have the conversation before they go out and shoot. Some properties are perfectly adequate for it and they're big enough, but when you're starting to look at those small properties and there's other houses around, you just need to be really, really careful in what you're doing and don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to find that the police turn up and take action that's not in anyone's interests.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michelle, there's an interesting question here from Andrew, who's asking, is it the landowner that needs to do the shoot plan or is it the hunter's responsibility?
Oh, yeah, I absolutely should have made that clear, and it is covered later. No, the shooter should do that. I will be going through that checklist of what a landholder should make sure that a shooter has done before they step foot on their property with a gun. And yeah, no, it's absolutely the responsibility of the controller to do those plans. And I'll go over other requirements that they need as well if they're going to be working on private land. But yes, no, I would not expect a landholder to do it. But if they have a map of their property, that's probably a really good start. But even as you can see from this example here, the properties surrounding it are also included. And that's actually critical because you need to know what's on the neighbouring property in case you get a deer that runs next door. And yeah, there might be stock next door. You need to have spoken to the neighbours next door to find out what's going on their property as well. Yeah, but I will go over that further. Great question. Oops, I think that, here we go. Okay, it's telling me I skipped a slide, but that's okay. So types of shoot programs. There's a few to pick between. Professional culling. Best used probably for strategic control of large numbers of deer and also in those peri-urban areas with small properties that are experiencing deer damage. That's because the professionals have the public place permits, they've got insurance, they have to have first aid if they're wanting to shoot with a suppressor, and they often have their own really high quality equipment. Not that that is an absolute necessity to shooting well, but it means that they're serious about it. They've spent some money and time to get themselves set up, and they might also have suppressors which can help with some of the neighbour complaints that you might get. Just addressing that question about noise. Suppressors reduce the sound by about 30%, so they don't make it silent. You still will hear it, but it can make it a little less perhaps unpleasant than having a large caliber firearm going off next door. Professionals are more likely to perhaps undertake the neighbour notifications for you. It's in their best interest. When they talk to the neighbours, they might also sign them up, and that's a positive because control over a larger area does give you a better outcome because you've got more properties involved and more area. And they are more likely to remove carcasses from your property as well, which might be an issue for some of the smaller properties. And I should add, though, when they remove carcasses, it might not be every single bit. They might leave the viscera, the slushy bits inside. They might get left on site, but they disappear pretty quickly. Some professionals do harvest deer, and harvested meat is used for human consumption or for pet food, and sometimes inedible render, so that's like fertiliser. The cost for a professional or commercial deer controller varies widely, so I really can't talk about rates specifically. They might charge an hourly rate, a nightly rate, or even a per deer rate. And you should find out what's included in the rate that they're charging. So some may seem very high, but they might only charge you for the hours they're spent shooting, but be inclusive of some other costs, which I'll explain. And others might charge less per hour, but bill you for admin or writing the shoot plan or something like that. So yes, there is more to deer control than just the actual shooting. Some of the other aspects of control are site inspections, vitally important. They might install and monitor trail cameras to get a better idea of what time the deer are turning up. They might run a drone survey, all sorts of things. They need to prepare a shoot plan, and they may also charge for travel, petrol, ammunition, transport to a knackery, waste disposal charge. There's a whole range of different costs, so that might be incorporated into that hourly rate, so you probably need to find that out before you proceed. But yeah, they're not necessarily an expensive option because they can be highly productive in short periods of time. And they also will make arrangements directly with landholders, so what to best suit your needs. So you need to consider how many deer that you have. So an hourly rate can sometimes end up cheaper than a per deer rate and vice versa. So you need to do your maths and just be really clear on what your budget limit is. And cost sharing with your neighbours is probably highly recommended. So you may have a cluster of 10 properties that are all interested in removing deer from the area. Some sites may be good for shooting and others may not, but you might all share the cost to make it a positive benefit for everybody. And we will be running a workshop on 14th of April, working with your neighbours, where we'll go in, have a look at some of the programs that do run that sort of a process and see how it works. Okay, volunteer culling. So volunteers might be used on your private properties, on those large farming properties under the GIC order, where you don't need a public place permit, or they may be coordinated by Parks Victoria or for Parks Victoria by the ADA, Australian Deer Association, their deer management program, or through the SSAA CPM, Conservation Pest Management, I think that's right. Program. So they're volunteer programs, but they work on some of those public land sites. And they're free, but only where that public place permit is not required. So it might be a good option for when numbers are already low and you only need a few deer removed occasionally. So we call them maintenance shoots, just to keep the numbers low, because it has been shown in a few studies, which I won't bore you with, but studies have shown that fewer numbers of deer are removed by volunteer shooters than they are by professionals. It might be to do with incentive and motivation, but that's not always the case. So if they're well set up with equipment that can enable them to easily remove deer, or they can leave animals in situ where they fall, they might be able to still remove large numbers of deer for you. So you might find that volunteers are absolutely your best bet. So I highly recommend working directly with ADA and Sporting Shooters leaders. Got that right? Yes, Sporting Shooters Association leaders. So speak to David or somebody from ADA, and they'll be able to set you up like a matchmaking service but on a professional level, with a volunteer hunter that can come out to your place, and that can be a really positive arrangement. Okay. David, did you have anything to add on the Farmer Assist or CPM program?
So we've basically got a couple of options. Our Conservation Pest Management program is probably a bit more coordinated, so that would probably be more appropriate if there was a group of properties that sort of got together and we could do it over a larger landscape sort of scale, and we can coordinate those sort of programs. Whereas if you've got an individual property, probably our Farmer Assist program would perhaps be more appropriate, where it's basically a matchmaking service that you can find a hunter with the relevant experience. It's really important though that landowners are clear and talk to the volunteer about what they want and what their expectations are, because at the end of the day, it's a landowner who controls the whole operation, and what they want is what they get. So it's important that, and some volunteers might want to shoot lots of animals. They might sort of have a particular view in mind, but it's really important that the landowner talks. And if that particular person's not going to suit their needs, then get somebody else to do it. But what we find is, once those relationships are made, because a lot of landowners are sort of reluctant to have somebody new on their property who they don't know discharging a firearm, and I understand that. But what we find is when they make those relationships, we find that they tend to be long term, and some of our volunteers have sort of been going to the same property for years and years, and that relationship develops and that trust develops. So yeah, there's plenty of options depending on what the landowner wants, and they run the whole program. Yep,
fantastic, good points there. Okay, so commercial harvesting. I guess it's a little similar to the professional culling option that have the same licenses and permits, plus a few others. But this is probably a good option for when there's lots and lots of deer, as commercial harvesters tend to make their income from the sale of the meat at the other end, rather than from the payment from the landholder. So they either need lots of deer, or they need lots of properties with a few deer. Or it wouldn't be commercially viable for them. So harvesters might charge a fee, or the works might be free, or the landowner may even be paid. And large numbers of deer can be removed through this process as well. They're motivated to take large numbers so that they can make more money. And so I guess the question I would ask is, could they be tempted to maintain a population for future harvest? Well, to be honest, I don't think they'd really worry too much about it, because we have so many deer that I think they could shoot for quite some time, and we're not going to run out. So I don't think that's an issue. And should also add that harvesters, this is for commercial harvesters or professionals that take carcasses to a knackery for processing as pet food or human consumption, they need to have undertaken particular training courses that are set by PrimeSafe, and they need to pay a fee. So they need to basically become an accredited harvester. So and not just a matter of saying, oh yeah, I'll take the deer to a knackery and get paid for it. There is a process to go through. Brett, would you like to add anything to conversation about commercial harvesting?
Currently the landholders are getting 50 cents a kilo for sambar, so there's no payment for fallow, but for sambar and for red deer. So any kilos that are taken off the property that night, within about 2 weeks they receive a payment back through their bank account. It all gets traced through a barcode system, so you can trace that animal from the property right through till the processing. But yeah, it's actually quite lucrative. Like some properties we shoot on, some of the people get sort of up to $500, $600 a night, depending on the volume of deer.
So what do you do when the numbers of deer on those properties start to dwindle? Do you just try and find other properties in the area? Like how do you make
that's probably the only option. It's got to be commercially viable for us, so we sort of need to go in, and we're shooting between sort of 10 and 16 a night per person. But we often shoot on multiple properties in the night, so we might do 3 or 4 properties in that night. So as long as we can get the farmers or any of the landholders joining to be part of the program, it makes it viable. And
yeah, great. That sounds good. Yeah, so again, a good option when you've got large numbers of deer to get rid of quickly, I suppose.
Okay.
Just on that, if I can, Michelle.
Yep.
There's not necessarily one answer to the problem. So it might be that you get a commercial operator in and then you follow up with volunteers, or you get a professional or something like that. So it's not all or nothing. There's horses for courses, and if the numbers are high, then it might be viable to have the commercial operator, and landowners can actually get some money for the animals that are taken off. But when it becomes uncommercial for them, you can get some of your volunteer programs in and just do that maintenance sort of operation. So, yeah, everyone remember that it's not just one solution. There's a whole lot of different things that can be done.
Absolutely. And I think I have that in a couple of paragraphs time, so I won't need to say it. So that's fabulous. Thank you. So recreational hunting. So this is probably not going to take out large numbers for us. So if you are looking to eradicate large numbers of deer off your property, it might not be the way to go. But again, it's always up to that individual and what they're happy to do for you. Recreational hunters can only hunt during the daytime with that game hunting permit, unless they're doing control under the GIC permit. But recreational hunting is daytime, so that's on those large properties that don't require the public place permits, or on public land like state forests or other reserves that have areas set aside for hunting. So it's possible that what they might take could be skewed towards the large stags, so they can decorate their walls like this, or just taking what's needed for personal consumption. So that might be limited. Again, you speak to that particular hunter and see what they would be happy to do for you and what works for you. So I guess although there are a lot of hunters, 39,000 in 2018, they don't take enough on their own to keep the numbers stable. So there's got a figure there of 121,500. Well, if the population of deer is correctly estimated at over 1 million, that's what we've got 10%. You need to take out at least 30% to keep the population stable, and even more than that to reduce it. So we need a lot more than just what is happening recreationally. And as David said, we do need a combination of approaches when working across larger areas. Even as far as helicopter culls in inaccessible areas, recreational or volunteer shooters in public hunting lands, and then doing those top-up shoots after perhaps the commercial harvesters or professionals have gone in. And it does need to be across land tenure, so we need to be looking at Parks Victoria, state forests, plantation areas, and private landholders as well, to get that benefit, so you're not just pushing the deer from one property and then back onto another. Okay, and finally, look, there are some other techniques out there, such as bow hunting, aerial shooting, trapping and baiting, but I'm not covering those tonight. And I think the methods that we're talking about are the ones that are likely to be more utilised in Nillumbik and actually have the biggest impact. All right, so this is kind of a summary. There's a lot of words there, so I'm just going to leave it on screen, just summarising some of those differences in terms of cost and motivations and permits and licences. But I just thought I'd leave that on there and see whether we've got any questions about the different controller types.
Yes, Michelle, Peter would like to ask a question.
Great. Unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep, beautiful. I was just wondering, look, I'm a recreational hunter, and I apologise, I didn't start on the meeting until 7:30, so I don't know what I've missed, but I was just trying to find out, like I said, I'm a recreational hunter. Should the onus be on the landowner to get the permit?
Which permit?
The permit to hunt on their own land, like to get hunters.
Oh, do you mean like should they be seeking out the hunter, or should the hunter be approaching them?
I'm suggesting that the landowner should be getting the permit to hunt on their land to bring in other hunters to hunt on their land. Is that right?
No, I think you might be talking about the public place permit. No, that's given out to the hunter themselves.
Right.
So the DFO can provide advice as to whether that permit is needed, but they don't apply the permit to the property. They apply it to the hunter working on that property.
See, my question is this: if I contact a landowner and they say yes,
Nope. Oh, I can't hear.
to the neighbours and get clarification from them.
Sorry, you just cut out there. I didn't hear the question.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I'm trying to find out if I approach a landowner and they say yes, you can come and shoot deer on my property. Do I need to? Let's say he's only got a 3 hectare property, right? Do I need to approach his neighbours, his or her neighbours, to get permission from them as well for me to shoot on the neighbour's property?
No, you don't.
Right.
It's a courtesy to notify the neighbours. What a landholder does on their property is their right to do. But it's the neighbourly thing to do is to talk to the neighbours and explain what you're going to be doing, to meet them so they have a face for the sound that they're hearing in the middle of the night. And then the landowner can speak to the district firearms officer to find out whether they think that there's a need for a public place permit. I do that on behalf of landowners sometimes myself, but then certainly if the permit is required, they would want to speak to you directly. They're not going to, or they can't give that direct to the landholder.
The concern.
Can I just jump in here, Michelle? It's Jake from Victorian Pest Animal Control. Just to clarify for you, Peter, if you're looking at the process and the order that you should do this stuff in, I would first be, approaching the landowner. If the landowner says, yes, I've got some deer and I want them shot, your next step would be, unless you're talking, 500 acres out in the middle of nowhere, your next step would be to contact the DFO and find out from the DFO if they're okay with you shooting on that property. And if they are, then your next step would be to just door knock the neighbours or have the person whose property it is contact the neighbours and let them know that you are going to be doing some shooting on whatever night you're going to be doing it on. Make sure that the landowner has signed your GIC paperwork, which is basically just your permission form to shoot deer on the property. And then on the particular night that you are going to shoot, as long as the DFO have said it's all right to do it, contact all the neighbours and let them know that you're going to be out there, and contact the local police and let them know you're going to be out there as well.
That's almost like a separate trip. It's like it would be so much easier if the onus was on the landowner to get all those permits. The
problem is, Peter, that you're the one who is responsible for discharging a firearm on that property, not the landowner. So effectively, you're the one that the onus is on, and you need to protect yourself. It's kind of like having a driver's license and making sure that you do everything yourself.
Yeah, when I spoke to the DFO yesterday, he was really clear that he only wanted people on properties that he thought needed the public place permit if they had all the appropriate insurances. Now, I know people are covered by sporting shooters and Australian Field Association insurances, but as it turns out, for public place permits, that's not sufficient. So they're going to want to talk to you specifically about your situation and what training and qualifications, accreditations and so forth that you've got to see whether you might qualify. It's complicated.
The other thing that may happen is, if the landowner says that the police have said it's okay to shoot on that property, and that they may or may not be telling the truth, and you go out there and discharge a firearm based on their word, and then the police come out and say, well, you're not allowed to do this on this property, then your head's going to roll, not theirs. So you really need to cover yourself.
That's right, but it's I mean, even if you get caught in deer country with a spot, like, does this mean that you're allowed to hunt at night on private property?
With that GIC order, yes, you are, because those hunting sort of rules don't apply because you're doing deer control. It's sort of as if you're controlling a pest animal. So yes, it's quite different. Happy to chat about this further because I think it's a big issue, but perhaps later if we've got a bit more time. But yeah, there's definitely a process to it. But I think Jake's outlined probably the best way to go about it. The landowner's not going to have a clue. At least you have some clue as to what you're planning on doing. You can talk about the methods that you want to use and so forth. All those things might be what helps the DFO decide whether he'd be happy for you to go out or not.
I think you'll find that a lot of people will be unwilling to risk their license getting confiscated and they're have their guns confiscated because the penalties for doing the wrong thing just by accident are huge, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why you should contact the DFO, get their approval. If they've said it's okay, then you are good to go. You would actually get something in writing. I would recommend you get an email or something in writing from them that says you're good to go there. And that way, if anyone pulls you over, you can say, I spoke to this person on this date, they've given me approval. And so then the onus is back on the DFO. So that's the best way to go about it.
Michelle, I'm happy to talk to Peter offline and give him some background on that. I think you missed before, Peter, when we were talking about this. As a recreational or volunteer sort of hunter, you need to be very, very conservative in the types of properties that you're going to try and get access to and shoot on. So if it's 3 hectares, yeah, I'd be looking very, very carefully at that and making sure that you've got all the appropriate stuff in place.
Yeah, that'd be great. Are you able to contact me offline?
Yep.
Great.
Yep, if you've registered, we should have your email address so we can start with that.
I definitely have,
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, any other questions? Thank you so much for that, Peter.
Thank you.
Yes, Michelle, there was another question which has been answered by Brett, but for anyone that's not following the chat, it was asking about is 50 cents per kilo for an eviscerated carcass, no legs and head. And the response to that is it's 50 cents per kilogram for the landholder with the head off and the legs on. The heart, lung and liver all stay with the carcass as well. There are also options for hunters to become professional harvesters. The harvester gets paid $2.50 per kilogram and the landholder gets 50 cents per kilogram. And the average weight of a sandbar is 86 kilograms.
Awesome. Yep. So that rebate amount probably varies between harvesters and also the amount that you get from the actual knackery. So Brett might be on a pretty good wicket with his $2.50 per kilo. It does vary a bit between meat processing facilities, and even within a meat processing facility, the price changes probably in response to changing market needs and so forth. So, and I should also add, there are hardly any meat processing facilities that are Prime Safe accredited that will take deer in Victoria. I know of currently one human processing plant that processes for human consumption. There's a couple for pet food. Brett's one is interstate in New South Wales, but there are a few options. So if anyone wants to start a deer processing facility, yeah, we'd be happy to hear from you because there's really not enough to go around. Any other questions?
Just finally, Peter, you might like to turn your video off. Thank you.
Yep. And Ralph? I don't know, maybe Ralph couldn't get his off. All good. Okay, is this going to click to go forward? Okay, shoot methods. This is probably where I might hand over to the contractors to give us a few more details on these methods. I might just randomly pick somebody to describe them. So the first method that we have is probably a fairly expected method, which is stalking on foot. And I'm going to dob in Jake to talk about stalking on foot. I'm trying to think of what's coming up next. Where would you
I've been
use
dobbed
this
in for it, have I? So basically, yeah, stalking on foot is stalking on foot. I think it's something that's used more by recreational hunters, especially if you're trying to recover meat, because the deer is often shot in a location that's difficult to get a car into. it can be quite an effective method. In fact, probably the most effective method to shoot them during the daytime when the deer are sort of off the paddocks and more up in the bush. It can help if you've got a dog and thermal equipment and stuff like that. But I would say from a culling perspective, or if you're trying to get greater numbers, stalking on foot during the daytime is less effective than shooting them at night time when they're all out in greater numbers in open areas where they're easier to target and easier to recover.
Yeah, yeah.
Does that cover it?
Yeah, 100%. Do you use hides as well? I can't get you to talk about all these things.
I can answer that if you want, or if someone else wants to.
Go for it. I've seen one.
Okay, so hide shootings, if you're shooting from hides and you're selecting an area where you know that there's regular deer movements, you're setting up a hide or a blind, something that covers you from view from the deer, but you can still see into that area, and you're basically exploiting their movements. So you're waiting for the deer to move into that area. It might be, in the evening when they're coming out to feed, and you're just basically shooting them as they come out. Now, it is a safer way to shoot, and probably a little bit better for maybe some smaller properties where there might be houses around, because you've got a controlled static shoot zone. Whereas if you're stalking on foot, which is quite difficult to do in the dark, but if you're stalking on foot, you're moving around. So if you're firing on animals when you're moving around, obviously you've got a moving background, so you're constantly got to be checking where your shot's got to go. If you set up and shooting from a static hide position, then you've got a controlled shoot area. And if you set your hide up in the correct location, you're going to have a controlled backstop. So it's a much safer way to do it, and it can be just as effective as stalking on foot.
Yeah, okay. So that'd benefit from having trail cameras up in advance, perhaps, to work out where those movements are going?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, anywhere that you're looking to ambush deer, then you're looking to have prior knowledge on those deer, on the deer movements in that area, and obviously cameras and local knowledge, checking ground sign, all that sort of stuff will help you with that information for sure.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, I think I might dob in Richard for this one, because I know he's got tree stands on his shoot plan.
Indeed. Tree stands are really very similar to the hides that Jake's already mentioned, and the principles for a hide are the same. What they do, though, is provide you elevation. Now, elevation can be very useful in sites where your shoot zone is constrained. If you're worried about bullet travel insofar as where your bullet may land. So in some terrain and on some smaller properties, it can be very beneficial. It can in some ways help to manage your scent, your smell, but you still, if the wind's blowing towards the animal, the animal will still get an idea that you're in the area, so they'll become wary. But yeah, same principle as a hide, just also provides elevation.
Yeah, cool. I mean, this one here, this structure looks pretty permanent. These ones that are literally attached to a tree, are they something that during the night or day, depending on when you're hunting, that you might take down and move somewhere else, or you pretty much that's your spot? That's it. Yeah,
look, people generally put them there for a season or a particular period of time. And yeah, that's actually a good photo, because you can see the fall restraint device in the back, which is a very good plan.
Yeah.
You do have to get up and down them. Their use at night can be challenging in that regard. You'd want to be pretty sure of yourself.
No,
I'm not going to be recommending that.
Yeah, okay. Shooting from a vehicle. I'd like to point out these vehicles are stationary when the shots are fired. Jake, I'm sorry to dob you in again, but I know that this is one of your faves.
That's all right, no worries. Yeah, we do where possible, and it's not always possible, but where possible we have a preference for shooting from vehicle. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the obvious one: you can cover more area and you can see more deer. Another reason is that deer are not disturbed anywhere near as much by the sound and look of a vehicle as they are by the sound and look of a human being walking towards them. So they're much easier to approach from the vehicle. And also too, where jobs require recovery and harvesting, you know, the vehicle needs to be in a position to recover those deer that are shot. And so if they're already shot from the vehicle, well, then you can make that assessment while you're actually there, which is good. You know, the vehicles are generally run as a two-person team, and you've got, like you just said, Michelle, none of the shots are taken unless the vehicle's stationary. But you've got a very solid and stable shooting platform, and you've got an elevated shooting platform, which firstly is safer because you've got a higher angle of trajectory to the ground. So, you know, a shot that may be missed or passed through an animal is on an angle towards the ground, not, you know, flying off into somewhere where you don't want it to. Plus, with the extra elevation, you can see further. So, where possible, you know, you need to have good vehicle access. You need to have tracks that there's no point in having an area and a vehicle shoot plan in an area with tracks that don't go near where the deer are. So, you know, it has to be evaluated on a site-by-site basis. But where possible, if the terrain allows for it, then vehicle-based shooting is definitely number one, in my opinion.
Okay, excellent. Ariel, don't think we'll use this in Nillumbik, but I'm just putting it here because we have probably all heard about programs that are happening generally in the Alpine area for Parks Victoria, and I think I did see some statistics for how many deer were being controlled through that method, but it was absolutely huge, to be honest. But I don't know any more about it, and it's not relevant for Nillumbik, so I don't think I really want to go into details on that one, unless somebody has an objection and wants to say where it will be easily used in Nillumbik. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Not a chance.
Okay, good stuff. Okay, so this is probably bringing together some of the things that I've just talked about, and it is my opinion on how I would go through the thought process of which control option I would select based on a number of different criteria. So I'm just going to step through this and explain why I would do these things. So why do you wish to shoot? I want to get trophies for my wall and have some fun. Okay, that's fine. That is recreational shooting. So those GMA maps will help you out in the sites where you can do that, or you may be able to do it, this recreational shooting on those large properties, potentially in the north of Nillumbik. So it's for recreational shooters, and that is done through the daytime with your game permit, a game license and firearms license. Okay. But I want to cull. I want to reduce deer numbers on private land. What do? That requires some strategic shoot plans. And where are you wanting to do it? Well, there's different options. We might be urban and close to houses. We're in those peri-urban areas with some houses, or we're in those rural, far from house areas. Do you need a public place permit? That is the next question you need to ask. It probably goes back to the question we just had before of who does what and when. Check with the DFO every single time. They have said that they don't mind being bugged about this. Okay, so if we are in urban areas close to houses, yes, you will need that public place permit. What about the peri-urban areas with some houses? We'll check with the DFO, but if he says yes, then you're looking at a professional deer controller or harvester. But what if you check with him and he says, no, you don't need a permit? Or what if you're in a rural area and you're far from houses? Don't need a public place permit, but you've checked, okay, just to make sure. Then the landowner might be able to do this themselves if they have a firearms license, or a volunteer can also do that control for you. Next question is, how many deer do you have, or how many are you wanting to have removed? If you've got low numbers of deer, or you've only got a couple of deer that need to be removed, again, a landowner or volunteer might be your best option. But if you've got high numbers of deer, I've said high to low because you can use them for both. I recommend that you use a professional harvester or harvester. Both of those will need the GIC Unprotection Order landowner agreement signed and carried on their person, so that if they get approached, they've got that in their hand. And that control can happen daytime or nighttime with spotlight and thermal vision. As I said, those game hunting rules do not apply. And a professional will have those public place permits and their shoot plan approved by Victoria Police, and they are quite likely to remove carcasses. So there are also other considerations. I think we've touched on a few of them tonight. A lack of good access might not be good for a professional who wants to cull high numbers and remove them from the site. So if you can't get the deer out, that's going to be a problem. So you might be assuming public place permit is not required. A volunteer might be happy to sit out there all night to remove some deer because they might want to fill their fridge or something like that. And poor access is obviously difficult for those vehicle-based operations. And then I've touched on the number of deer, but also, are they transient? Are they just moving through on their way to another site, or are they always there? So that's another factor to consider, because are you happy for someone to be sitting around your property, potentially charging you by hour, if the deer only come through at a certain time? Well, one, that's probably up to the professional to have their cameras out and to get a sense of those patterns of the deer and to say, right, I'll come out at this time, that's when the deer are coming through. Or you might need to think about someone who's happy to sit around and wait for those deer. The other thing you do need to consider, as I said, it's not something to stop you doing control, but approval of your neighbours is something you need to consider, because you have to live next door to them, right? You don't want to sour that relationship because, yeah, who wants to move? So you don't need their approval, but it does help. And that notification process, as I mentioned, is really important because it does really help in alleviating their concerns. They know what's happening and when. They've met the person that's doing the control work, and they're expecting to hear a couple of gunshots go off, but don't have to think that somebody is being hurt. Okay, managing a neighbour who is against the killing of animals, well, that's a tricky one to overcome, and I can only recommend that perhaps you show them the damage that the deer are causing to your property, and explain to them why it is that you felt that this is an avenue you'd have to go down. Okay, so it's a pretty complicated sort of thought process. Does anyone have any different thoughts or comments on that? All I can hear is silence, which is great.
It's because you've nailed it.
Oh!
It's well covered. Well covered. It's a very useful little mind map.
Well, it was a mind map, and you can see my comments at the end, which weren't captured. There's always other things to consider, and I think that's where going out onto the site and having a look and really seeing what can be done. What can be done at all, like what I actually haven't covered in here is it urban, close to houses, and just not possible to do any decent control if those deer are transient and aren't there, but they're coming through occasionally and they're eating your rose bushes, they've damaged your vegetation, your vegetable patch, sorry, but you really are not going to get any large numbers of deer. You're better to talk to your neighbours with the larger properties. You're better to contact council and say, I'm having an issue, and we can have a look at the broader area and see if we can determine some areas that might be better for you to do, well, not for you to do control, but to try to engage some landholders that have a much better property for doing some control, where you can actually remove some large numbers of deer. I think that's really critical to know. You have to look very far at a much broader scale than just your individual property, even though I totally understand that you're frustrated with the fact that the deer are damaging your property. Any other questions, Kirsten?
Michelle, can you just confirm again, whose responsibility is it to contact the district firearms officer, property owners or the hunter?
Yeah, the hunter for sure. They've got extra information. The property owner can only tell them where the property is, but the DFO will certainly want to speak to the hunter.
And if anyone's interested in or has questions about the use of bows, There's some information on that in the chat going on.
Yeah, is that the Australian Bow Association potentially? Yeah, look, this session is about shooting, so I haven't thought too much about it, but yeah, it is something that people can consider as well. But
there's some chat in the chat if you want to follow that. Finally, Michelle, is it possible to have a register at the council to link landowners with recreational shooters?
Oh gosh, that just sounds like exactly what we're doing. What a wonderful idea. So is that a leading question that someone's given to me? Okay, so I will be covering this a little later, but we are putting together a local community deer directory. We would prefer to have locals where possible. They're a bit more responsive to going, oh, there's a deer here now, and can come out, you know, that night, hopefully. So this directory will be deer controllers, but it will also include those that are volunteer and recreational and other services that might assist with deer management. So there might be fencing contractors, people that might do drone surveys for monitoring. There'd be a range of services, no doubt, and I encourage anyone who is in that field who has something that they can offer for landholders to contact me or to join our industry mailing list. So we will have an information session for those that are on the industry mailing list. I'll send out that sign-up sheet for that with the video after the event. And yeah, so we'll be running through what our requirements are to be on that directory and what we would expect, like best practice behaviour, I suppose, and so including those neighbour notifications and so on and so forth. But in getting to the recreational hunters, we will be permitting people to go on that list, but we will be having some minimum requirements. They haven't been 100% ironed out yet, so I won't go into them. But I guess ultimately we would prefer that if anyone wants a recreational shooter, that they go through the Sporting Shooters Association or ADA to get that matchmaking process, as David mentioned before, mainly because they're quite good at being able to pick out who they think are the better hunters in their groups, that have had the most experience and that would be and more experience in peri-urban areas in particular. And yeah, so the directory will have a range of information on it with contact details and also whether you've got those public place permits and those sorts of things, so that when the landowner comes to choose, they can filter the data and say, I need a professional, I need a recreational person, and find contacts that way. And we will also have a meet and greet for the people that get on the directory. We will be running a session, I think the 30th of May at the Hurstbridge Hub. So for the people that are on the directory, they can come along and hand out business cards and so forth. So it might be a bit trickier for a recreational person to have a spiel to give out, but yeah, so that directory will be put together, or is being put together now. So contact me if you want some more information about that whole process.
Michelle, how does that compare to Farmer Assist?
It probably is an overlap for sure. I guess the only difference would be that we've got people that are local, and I think, and David can talk about Farmer Assist, but it hasn't been a big program in Victoria. Maybe this would be some sort of impetus to get that that program expanded. But yeah, there would be some crossover. There's no doubt about that, but the difference would be that it's a list of professionals and volunteers and recreational hunters. So if you do need that contact for someone who is a professional and has the public place permits, that will be on that list as well. And we will in no way be endorsing any of the people on this list. We I don't have any experience with any hunters other than Jake, or controllers other than Jake and Richard. So I know there's a lot of great hunters out there, and for a lot of people, it's actually just meeting them and seeing whether they have a good rapport with them. And that's one of the things that the ADA said to me recently, that they like to be able to match personalities, and I think that's a great thing. Any other questions?
Michelle, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm on a small small property in Patton Hill. In fact, I'm actually in the township.
Yep.
But we have a serious deer problem, and my bigger concern is they are the largest variety, which I think called Sabino, and the health and safety issue. Where we're adjacent the football field and adjacent kindergarten, the school, and potentially the public risk is very high. Whose responsibility actually is it for these eradication of this deer? And also we have another thing, we don't only just have deer, we have wild pigs as well.
God.
And so that's who's responsible for those as well?
Yeah, well, that's a really excellent question, and I don't know why I didn't mention this earlier. Nobody's and everybody's is probably the answer. Deer are not currently listed as a pest species, so we can't enforce any landowner to undertake control for deer. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why there's a reluctance to list them as deer species, that the onus is too great to ask a landowner to do that. I don't know whether it would be enforced, but anyway, that's one issue. So I guess ultimately the state government is responsible in terms of setting policy on it. However, I think at the moment it really is just up to landholders to manage their property for the risks that they're seeing. And I know that's probably not what you want to hear, but it doesn't sit with council, for instance, as the responsible body for managing deer at all. They're still a game species protected under the Wildlife Act. So it's a really complicated one. Pigs, they're a pest animal, so you can certainly get them controlled by a licensed pest controller. I'm horrified to think that there might be wild pigs in Panton Hill, and I think that's definitely worth reporting and following up on. But I know you sent me some photos of the deer at your property, and they look huge and scary. And yes, some of these deer are massive. And in townships like Housekeeping, we would be certainly looking at protecting your property individually, perhaps with a fence if that might be required, to protect your gardens and so forth. But we'd be looking further afield and looking at some of the larger properties that trying to think of where the closest ones are, but there are some larger properties in the area, and we'd be wanting to target those for control. We have expanded our Sugarloaf Link project, and it does include areas around Panton Hill, but the nearest that we're controlling is south of Bunjil Reserve. So yep, it's a tricky question, but we're certainly happy to work with you offline to identify some options for you. And it's part of our project is actually to undertake some site assessments. So I can come out with one of our contractors and or the district firearms officer to assess for the need for a public place permit, but I'm fairly confident you would need one there.
Yes.
But yeah, I think your property is probably one of those candidates I was speaking about earlier, where you get those deer coming through, perhaps not large numbers, but a contractor could, if you've got resident deer there, and the professional contractors can probably take those out, and hopefully it'll be a while before new ones move in.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
They seem to actually be sleeping there during the night, and they are wallowing.
Yeah.
In the wet area, so. But also the other problem is I have a lot of kangaroos, I have wombats, I have echidnas, and some other animals are undefined, like peacocks.
What? Yep. Okay.
They photographed them, you see. So I'm saying this was what all the things I've got in the backyard. That's another concern, that there's so much wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are going to be covering that in our session on the 19th of May, property management to reduce deer damage. Richard will be presenting that and going through some of the non-lethal control options. So we'll be talking about fencing, deterrence, sound deterrence, light deterrence. There's electric fencing, even just changing the behaviour of deer in the short term to get them to move on. There's a whole range of options that we can look at, and certainly we recognise that deer are not the only animal that are damaging our properties. So fencing and other options that we consider need to take in all of those species into account.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Michelle, a flurry of questions. First of all, we've been advised that wild pigs are a pest animal.
Yeah.
And the land manager is responsible for controlling those.
That would be correct, yes.
Yep. And some questions around public place permits. So is it for one site or for multiple sites?
Yeah, so yeah, great question. They used to be per site. I think I might have touched on this very briefly. And
they still are. They still are, but you can also get an annual if you're a professional.
Yes, yes. Well, Richard, given you were talking to me about it today, perhaps you can just expand.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Cool, cool. And look, I think Jake did kind of put up a bit of an answer in the so professional contractors can get an annual public place permit. That's on the basis that they provide sufficient evidence. And then you've got particular sites where you may get a public place permit for your particular property during a particular period. And so that's quite common. And that was the general process up until recently, and it's still there. And that's probably the only way a non-professional may be able to get a permit. But I can't speak on behalf of Victoria Police, of course.
No, absolutely. When I was chatting with them a couple of days ago, yeah, I very much got the feeling that if you weren't a professional, they were not particularly keen on the thought of giving out a permit. But maybe, yeah, if it is just for a single property and they recognise that you know it intimately and so forth and can demonstrate that you know how to shoot at that property really safely, can show those shoot plans that lay it all out, that might make a difference. But yeah, it's always worth having that conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, the key issue is the insurance, usually the liability.
Yes.
Yep. Which, if you're the landowner, you can take that responsibility.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
And Michelle, if you need to have the carcass removed from your property, does that restrict you to having to use a professional hunter, or are there other options?
No, and it's actually my next slide.
Okay, move on. Perfect timing.
Oh, yeah, that's it for, yeah, okay, cool. Yes, see, I did not lie. So yes, disposal of carcasses is definitely one of the sticking points. What to do with those remains? Ideally, all the deer is used in some way rather than wasted. That would be the best thing to do. So with the meat used to feed the hunter or the landholder, and the antlers, maybe use them to make buttons or knife handles, or, you know, trophy heads on the wall, whatever you're into. And I'm putting together a fact sheet that includes some yummy venison recipe ideas as well. But if you're not going to be consuming the meat yourself, the carcass can be taken to a meat processing facility, knackery, for processing into food for people, pets, or as inedible render, which is fertiliser, basically. Okay, so yeah, disposal of carcasses is not always easy. The animals can be really hard to retrieve if they're in a gully or behind trees. It can be difficult to drag out with a winch or any other way. I mean, recreational hunters chop them into bits and put them in a backpack. Even these things make me squirmy still after all this time. So there are ways of getting them off your property, but they're not always easy. So leaving them in situ, so where they drop, might be okay if they're not visible or smellable by others, your neighbours, but bearing in mind that any carcasses left on site might attract foxes, but then you can come back and you can shoot the foxes as well. But they also provide food for raptors. I mean, I always think that the deer have got to die somewhere naturally, so we'll be getting animal carcasses in the environment at some point, whether it's by our hand or naturally. And yes, anyone can remove a carcass if they've got the time and the equipment. So as I said, that might be cutting them up and putting them in a backpack, leaving some of the remains behind, or it might be dragging them to your car and winching them onto a trailer using four-wheel drive winch or something. Okay, and harvesting does take some time. I think we estimated it took about 25% of our on-site time for our control program, because not only do you have to get them to your vehicle, you need to eviscerate them. Eviscerate is taking out all the guts and stuff, and you need to do that within a certain time frame to meet the meat safety standards. I just wanted to quote something from the Game Management Authority. There is no legal requirement for hunters to recover all of a deer that has been harvested, but the GMA encourages hunters to maximise the use of any game that are harvested and dispose of the remains. Dispose is a bit of a weird term, because to me that means put it in the bin. But disposal under legislation is all about sale or trade or donation. So if you're talking about disposal, there are a lot of rules that PrimeSafe have set out as to what you can and can't do with harvested game deer. To harvest commercially requires PrimeSafe qualifications. There's a number of qualifications or accreditations that they require you to undertake, and you have to pay fees and so forth. So a recreational hunter can't take deer to a licensed meat processing facility. There are unlicensed meat processing facilities that might be like an on-farm butcher or somebody that comes to you and so forth. So a recreational hunter can use one of those services, but basically what they're doing is cutting the meat up into chops and backstraps and so forth, and then giving it back to the landholder or the hunter. You cannot provide meat to a meat processing facility that is then on-sold unless you've got those PrimeSafe qualifications. But if you can't harvest, what do you do with that venison that's in excess of your personal needs? Well, yeah, so leaving in situ is okay if it's not obvious to others, but it's not always a great option. If you've got lots of deer, it can get pretty smelly for a few weeks, depending on weather and how wet the soil is. There's a range of factors that determine how long it takes to break down, but it actually is surprisingly quick, but it can be surprisingly smelly during that time. You can bury on site, but there's a bunch of rules that relate to that process that's been set out by the EPA, and I think I was reading the Animal Health Australia Disposal Manual, which has a lot of guidance as to how that can be done. A landholder or someone who's not a harvester can take deer to be processed for inedible render. So that's not a bad option because the whole animal can be taken and used for that. You can take it to some waste disposal centres, but that would require that you pay a tip fee, and that can add up. So be frustrating as a harvester. You can take it away and get paid for it, and as a non-harvester, if you took it to the tip, you'd pay to dispose of it. So it's not great. But the advantage of landfill is that it might already be licensed to accept animal materials. We call it putrescible. No, I can't call it because I can't pronounce it. Putrescible waste. And those centres generally have the infrastructure to manage the long-term containment issues such as leachate and gas and so forth. And then the other option is, well, how about just give all that excess meat to my friends? No, you can't. I think a lot of people do, but it contravenes the Meat Industry Act because it comes under that heading of disposal. It's donation. If you got something back for it, then that would be traded, and if you got money for it, that's sale. But even donation contravenes the Meat Industry Act, so you can eat it on your property. The hunter can take it to his property, but that's about the extent of it. So you can have some barbies, but don't give it away to friends to have barbies at their house. Okay, I don't really want to have to go into this unless there really are some questions about it, but let's just say that this is about burial. When you play back the video, you can pause it here if you'd like a bit of extra information. Okay, I guess before we head on, any urgent questions at this point, Kirsten?
Michelle or Jake or Richard, what's the definition of a professional hunter?
I think Jake's already listed it there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It depends who's asking. If you're the police, then they will have assessed whether or not you are a commercial operator in their eyes, which means you've demonstrated that you're reliant on income from that process of using firearms. And being a game harvester is not necessarily enough. So it's a police process. So professional for getting something like a public place permit means that the police have assessed you as such, and it will be listed on your license. So it'll say vermin.
Your firearms license, you mean?
Your firearms license. It'll say vermin control or something along those lines on your firearms license. And that's a category under the Firearms Act that's recognised.
Yes, that's a good reminder. I forgot that was where it was. So yes, that is registered vermin controller or professional hunter, I think were the two terms that I was given. And yes, it is on the permit. It's an interesting one because there is currently no special test or qualification that you do as an extra step to becoming professional. It is about having those contracts and demonstrated experience in place. And yeah, so if you do hunting all the time, you do have the ability to become professional just by taking that next step and registering a business name. And as Richard said, yeah, demonstrating that that you're reliant on it for your income.
So you're basically, it's a cart before the horse. You have to already have contracts before you can get it listed on your license.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky.
Odd.
And Michelle, where do people go to find information on Prime Safe qualifications and how to get them?
I've posted that already, Kirsten. So in the chat, I've put the link to the provider.
Is that the Game Harvester course, Richard?
Correct.
Great.
You need,
so
you need to have the
chat.
correct qualifications in order to then apply to Prime Safe. So head to the chat. Yeah.
I think I've probably got a slide later on as if we have time, I'll show it with the list of the requirements, the qualifications and the payment schedules and so forth. You also have to have a vehicle that's registered to actually harvest the animals as well.
Yeah.
I would ask Brett for further information, but as he's New South Wales, the qualifications are a little bit different.
Same course.
But basically just type in Prime Safe and harvesting and it will come up. And I think there's even links from the Game Management Authority hunting pages to commercial use of meat, etc. So there's lots of links that will get you through to the Prime Safe site.
So the thing is that the course is a national course. It's a TAFE course. The licenses and the regulations associated with that are state specific, but it's the same course throughout Australia.
Yes. Okay, that sounds right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's really important to point out to people, because I get this query all the time. Hunters sort of think they're going to become professional hunters because there's a bit of money going around for contracts. It's extremely expensive to set up as a harvester. There's a whole heap to it. It's not just as simple as going and becoming registered as a professional and going out and shooting animals. So you really need to do your homework and have a proper business plan. And I'm sure Jake and Richard would back that up. It's not just a simple thing that you can just go from recreational hunting to a professional.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, shall I move on? So arranging deer control and shooting in Nillumbik. If this will click. All right, so yes, we recommend that coordinated efforts are undertaken at a landscape scale to get better impact, as well as sharing of costs. You can do it over a number of different properties and at a fairly large scale, so the number of large properties if possible, so that you've got more options. The deer are always going to be on the property next door, right? So if you've got this property alone that you're signed up to do works on, it is guaranteed the deer is going to run over there. So if you can have a number of landowners all signed up together, you've got a better chance of getting to that deer that you can see. And yeah, if you can get all the different landholders to coordinate share the cost, that's fabulous. Suppressors can help. The professional contractors often use these. There's less animal disturbance, so they believe that leads to greater productivity, and you can reduce those noise complaints that you might get from neighbours. The other thing with professionals is that they do have pretty good high quality equipment that they're really familiar with, and that makes a huge difference. You've got to know your equipment. And I guess on that, another plug, we have a deer control technology night or evening, Friday 7th of May, where some of Jake's guys are going to be showing us some thermal monoculars and different bits of equipment that I always kind of forget the names of, infrared scopes and so forth. So if you want to see what the guys use and have a go, it won't be any guns, just the thermal equipment. Come along to that session. It's on the Eventbrite page. Oops.
Hi Michelle, it's Jake again. It'll be thermal monoculars, some of the scopes we use, some night vision equipment, why we don't use the night vision equipment and why we use thermal, and just talking about the pros and cons of a few different brands that are available at the moment.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Michelle, can recreational hunters attend?
Oh, yeah, yep, and landholders can attend as well if you're curious about what goes on. I'm certainly going to be there. It's being held at the Rob Roy Hill Climb site, but you will need to book in. For practicality purposes, we have limited the numbers. I can't remember if it's to 30 people, but if there's really huge interest, then we'll run another session if we can squeeze it in. Okay, yeah, get advice from experts. Council is becoming expert, but if we're not, then we have these great controllers and contacts on our side who can advise you the best locations for control and which properties you might want to include if you're doing a wider area control program. So yeah, if you've got any questions about whether you can do control on your property, give us a call and we'll start you off on that path. I did go through in quite some detail that we are developing a community deer directory, which will list volunteer and professional hunters or controllers on there who might be able to assist you. We prefer that residents are able to approach a hunter that they've selected rather than being cold called by strangers. I personally would find it a little bit unnerving if I had someone just knock at my door and say, can I shoot here? It might be fine, but you might think that if you say no, that you're going to have someone poach on your property. And so it's just a really uncomfortable feeling. So let's let the landholders decide, or maybe you could just tell them you've got a deer problem and they can decide what to do from there. And yeah, as part of this directory, we are developing some checklists for the landholders to make sure that they've thought about everything they need to think about and have a better understanding of who's coming to their property and when, what they'll be doing, where they're going to be shooting and what will happen with the deer afterwards. And as part of that, there's also best practice guidelines for the hunters as well. Okay, so here's the checklist that I have put together. There might be some more things that you can think of that we should add, but this is what I've got so far. All right, be clear on your goals. What do you want to achieve? Do you want many deer removed, just a couple every so often? You know, how many, what's your problem? And that will determine the type of shooter and frequency of visits that are required. Get approval from the DFO for shooting. Now, the landholder can contact the DFO to find out whether a permit is public place permit might be required. But as I said before, it's better that the question also comes from the hunter, just to make sure they've covered everything off and the DFO gets to meet them and know who they are. If a public place permit is needed, make sure that your controller has one. Get all the controller's details, check that their licenses are current, and that's for all shooters that are turning up, okay? So don't just make an arrangement with one shooter who then might bring out a different mate every time. You should know who is coming onto your property. I think that's really important. So make sure that you know all those people and they've all got the appropriate insurances and licenses and permits as required. I may have covered this earlier, I can't remember. The insurance that is provided by Sporting Shooters Club membership or the ADA, Australian Deer Association memberships, they only apply if the hunter is volunteering their time. So if you have somebody who is a member of one of those clubs who says it'll be $20 an hour, that has now become a commercial agreement and that insurance does not apply. So don't pay for them or make sure they've got their own personal insurance. We recommend $20 million liability.
Just quickly on that, Michelle, and
oh yeah,
if any SSAA member ever turned up and was requesting payment for any activities, certainly contact the state office and let us know, because that just should not happen at all. Yeah. Yes, you want them to be a professional if they were going to charge you for that. I don't know whether if you're reimbursing someone for petrol costs for getting to your property, whether that is classed as payment. I'm not sure. Yeah, that would. I mean, all our programs are completely voluntary, so the landowner should not be out of pocket at all. They shouldn't be paying for ammunition. They shouldn't be paying for petrol. They shouldn't be paying for anything. The volunteer is there as a volunteer, and there's no cost involved. All right, great. That's really clear. Thank you. Yeah, get references.
Michelle or anyone else there on the panel, can landowners be liable for whatever penalty if the shooter is not properly accredited?
Well, there is no accreditation as such. If they haven't got their, if they haven't got a firearms license, they're going to be in strife. So you do need to do some sort of due diligence, but it's like hiring a builder or any other tradesperson. They need to have insurance that will cover them for their work. I think I'm right in saying that. If I'm wrong, let me know. Yeah, and this is why we were saying before that it's up to the shooter. The landowner can check out and see whether they need a public place permit or whatever, but it always comes down to the shooter. They are responsible as a shooter for what they do in discharging their firearm, and they need to make sure that what they're doing is lawful at all times. Yeah, and yeah, that the clarity for the public places is not there. So I would recommend that whoever is contacting that district firearms officer, that you get that okay in writing via email, so you can tick that off on your checklist and say, yep, he's got the permit, I've seen it, I can see it's still current, because they do expire. Yeah. Oh yeah, so get references if you can. So it's always good to make sure that they have worked in the area and someone can vouch for them as being good at what they do. Yeah. Agree on the control methods that are going to be used. Are they going to be sitting in a hide, stalking, vehicle based? Make sure that you know what they're going to be doing and where they're going to be doing it. It'd be good if they gave you a shoot plan copy. Whether that's a volunteer or not. Agree on the cost. Yes, it might be free, but if there is a fee, make sure you understand what it is and whether there's a rebate. Agree on that carcass management. You may say, 1 or 2 deer is okay, but please remove the rest. So they might leave them on site. They might take legs and back straps. They might take the whole animal. They might provide it to the landholder. You can arrange whatever you like with them. Absolutely undertake a daytime site visit. Make sure you've walked around with the controller and they know where the boundaries are, because sometimes there's not fences. Make sure they know where it is, where the boundaries are, where there are stock, where there are animals, where there are hazards. Get them to point out what they think are the safe shoot areas so that you know where they will be and what direction they'll be shooting. And also look at those neighbouring properties. Don't just look at them, actually. Go and talk to them. Make sure that you know what stock or animals or other issues are on neighbouring properties. Prepare that shoot plan and risk assessment and submit it to the DFO if that public place permit is required. Agree on the dates and times for shooting. You might be able to do that well in advance, but a couple of days notice or at least 24 hours notice is probably nice to give the landowner as well as the neighbours as well, just in case they've got a party on and it's inappropriate for you to come out that night. Notification plan, I've mentioned this before, you should talk to the neighbours, you should get a list of all the neighbours' names and their best contact method, phone or like text message or email, and agree on what method you're going to contact them to advise that you're going to be there. So you need to advise Victoria Police that you're going to be going out and at what time and date, and also those neighbours, so that if anyone hears some shooting and reports it, they can say, oh, that's Joe Blow, he's shooting on this property. And then you'll all be good. And you also might want to arrange with them whether they notify you when they've arrived on the site and when they're leaving, but just bearing in mind that it might be the middle of the night. Oh, and I should say for times of shooting, you may also arrange that they only shoot on certain nights of the week or during certain time periods. You might not want them shooting after midnight. Make sure all of that is set down on paper. Ensure that GIC landholder permission form is signed and the hunter or controller is carrying it, and put some signs up at the property entrances to let people know that hunting is underway. It's definitely a requirement for professionals, but it is recommended for anyone else who's out there as well. And they should leave your property as they found it, but minus a few deer. That'd be good. And one of the things we will be asking anyone on this directory is to advise us that they have shot on a particular property and how many deer they've removed. You can email us, or better still, record it on deer scan, because there is options for recording control. All right, so have I missed anything? If you think that I've missed something or got it wrong, I'm happy to have that chat. We want to get this right, both for landholders and the hunters. So hopefully that covers most of what you are feeling that you were wanting to ask tonight, and you've got a better understanding of what to expect as a landholder and some of those different approaches. And if you're ready to take the next step and move on to find out more, we do have some other information sessions. Oops, there's that get a report from the controller. One more click, it's always there, isn't it? Okay, so this is a range of workshops and activities that we've still got up coming up as part of the project. I've mentioned them as we've gone through. So we have a session coming up in a couple more weeks for managing deer with your neighbours. That's all about getting collectives together to forming action groups and maybe pooling some funds, different approaches that we can look at. I've got the community deer directory that so that's a session for the hunters. So that is by invite only for the people that are on our industry mailing list, because it's not really relevant to landholders. That is to sign up the people that want to be on our deer directory and to run through what we would expect of you. And hopefully it's not asking too much. And we've got our property management session on Wednesday, 19th of May, which is the non-lethal options for deer management, so fencing and deterrence and habitat management and so forth. I'm also running a few site inspections. I've been out to a couple of people's properties and I've got a couple more planned on the way. So if you are having a deer problem, like Ralph earlier, and want somebody to come out and have a look and help assess the level of damage, the number of deer that you might have, and whether you need a public place permit. Obviously, we'd still need to check with the DFO. He may even come with us, and we can look at some other control or management options. And there's a couple of sites that I've identified that have some really good deer sign and damage. Well, not good, it's bad actually, but I'll be arranging some field days to go out and have a look at those and just to get a bit of feel for what deer damage actually looks like. Night vision, we mentioned that. We've mentioned the meet and greet with the people that are going to be on our deer directory, very exciting, and ongoing citizen science activities. Please dob in a deer. I don't want one day, I want you to do it daily. No pressure. It would be great to get some more records coming in of deer in other locations so that we get a better feel for where they are across Nillumbik. And that is the end of my slides, and I can see that we've only got 5 minutes left, so we can cover a couple of more questions.
Michelle, you mentioned in your checklist that the property owner should check all licences.
Yep.
Is there a list of all the licences that are required?
Oh, firearms licence. And the public place permit if it's in a public area. But yes, I'll make sure that that is all in there. The directory ultimately will be something that people can enter their details in online to provide that information about what services they offer. And then for the landholder, there will be the checklists available and some other information on and what to look for, what the minimum requirements you should ask for from your hunter. It's really tricky to specify anything other than licenses because there really isn't very much available, but we can have some suggestions of courses that might have been undertaken, and that will give you an indication as to whether this person is really serious about doing some great control work. So like managing, there's some courses on humane use of firearms to destroy game. That's not quite the right title, but along with the TAFE qualification for the harvesting, there are some other courses on use of firearms for game destruction. Sounds really nasty, but there's a few courses that you can ask for, but none of them are mandatory. The only thing that is going to be mandatory is that firearms license and making sure that's current. And yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. And a nice one perhaps to close on is the question, can private landowners coordinate their efforts with those of Nillumbik Shire?
Oh, yes, please. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Yes, please, absolutely. We're always trying to find out where people are actually doing current works, and yeah, if we can work in and definitely try and work on council properties that are adjacent in particular, or to help with pulling together some other landholders around there to make a better project area, that would be fabulous. And yeah, we'll go through that more with that managing deer with your neighbours session as well. Along with, talking about whether council can help subsidise those works in any way. So we're always looking for grants in particular, so that we've got a nice big chunk of money to do lots of work across really large areas. So we'll continue to apply for those grants, and that'll make it much easier for us to pull in the landowners that are having issues. Yep.
Michelle,
that's the last question then.
Michelle, Stephen Kaiser, just a suggestion. I'm a new landholder. I don't know what a shooter's licence looks like. I don't know what a popular place permit looks like.
Oh, yep.
Can there be some document that I can have so I can look at those? Because I'm not sure. The guy just flashed something at me. I don't know what it looks like.
Yep.
Just a suggestion.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was actually just trying to find my slide. I did have some copies, and for some reason it wasn't coming up there. That's a game license. But yep, I haven't got copies of the firearms permits, but there we go, public place permit. Apparently they're quite variable. Silencer permits, yeah, can certainly put copies of that in. That's a really good idea, Stephen. You're right. People might fake it and flash something and pretend that it's a license. So take copies of them if you can. Take a photo with your phone. If you're not convinced it's legit, send it to your DFO, send it to us. We'll do what we can to check that it's legit. I suppose that's one of the reasons why it's a good idea to go through our Deer directory, because we will check that those details are current for you.
That's it for questions, Michelle. Just some nice comments coming through saying thank you for this evening's webinar.
Oh, well, that's brilliant. And wow, it's 9 o'clock on the dot. So look, thanks to all my guests and everybody for joining in. So we have Jake, Richard, Brett, David and Kirsten. I think I got everyone's name. Thanks heaps for helping me answer those questions. Look, people are still trying to get into the lobby. It's time to leave, guys. I hope to see you at one of the sessions coming up. And if you have any direct questions, absolutely get in touch with me and we can talk. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and we will meet again soon.
Thanks, Michelle. Nicely done.
Thanks, Michelle. Amazing, as usual.
All right, no worries.
Right.
You're hired.
Yeah, you're on board.
Okay, thank you. I shall end the meeting now.
Cheers,